Welcome back to Let's Talk About It, the social work podcast, where this season we are exploring disparities experienced by Black veterans within the VA system. I'm your host, Edward Parati Sousas. This episode takes us into the invisible machinery of equity, data. If episode 7 exposed what happens when representation and DEI infrastructures are weakened, then episode 8 asks an equally urgent question. Who holds the keys to the data that defines an equity in the first place? Inside the Department of Veteran Affairs, data are the building blocks of policy, funding, and research priorities. Yet access to that data, meaning who can see it, who can use it, and who's allowed to interpret it, remains tightly controlled. And this matters because the VA takes evidence-based practice approaches. These gatekeeping practices, while often justified in the name of privacy or compliance, have profound implications for equity. When the VA restricts data access or limits external collaborations, it doesn't just control numbers, it controls narratives. And in doing so, it shapes which inequities remain visible and which are allowed to persist unseen. We have to start here because every episode so far, whether discussing pain care, disability claims, intersectionality, or even climate, relied on data visibility. When something isn't measured, it isn't funded, and when it isn't funded, it isn't fixed. As Washington et al. In 2023 emphasized in the National Veteran Health Equity Report, data is not neutral. It reveals patterns of structural racism in patient experience, chronic disease management, and access to high-quality care. But even that landmark report depends on the VA's willingness to release race-stratified data in the first place, a willingness that can shift with political winds. Historically, data about Black veterans have been sparse, fragmented, or inconsistently collected. Peltzman et al. 2022 and Hernandez et al. 2020 both point out that the VA's race and ethnicity fields have been riddled with quality issues for decades, from missing data to misclassification. Umklov et al. In 2023 tested electronic self-report methods that improved accuracy, but implementation remains incomplete. When datasets are incomplete or poorly maintained, the effect is not technical, it's structural. It means the inequities we already know exist become harder to prove. This lack of transparency also stifles the research ecosystem. Scholars like Kaplan 2024 warn that increasing federal restrictions on health data through new Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services access rules may hamper replication and innovation, especially for independent or equity-focused researchers. Inside the VA, similar restrictions mean that external researchers, particularly those led by or partnering with Black investigators or advisory panels, face steep barriers to accessing data for equity studies. When gatekeeping determines who gets to ask questions, it also determines which questions are never asked. That's not a hypothetical concern. It's an equity problem. As Winker, Bloom, and Ani 2023 argue, the open science is foundational to equity, transparency, and accountability. Restrictive data systems protect the status quo by limiting who can test it. Rabin et al. 2024 extend that argument in Translation Behavioral Medicine, suggesting that equitable data sharing requires community-based authorization, where affected populations, such as Black veterans, hold power in deciding how their data is used. In other words, representation cannot stop at the clinic, it must extend into the dataset. Even in AI and digital medicine, the same logic applies. Alberto et al. In 2023 in the Lancet Digital Health warned that when commercial or proprietary health datasets dominate research, bias multiplies. AI systems trained on unrepresentative or racially skewed VA data can reinforce inequities instead of correcting them. Carey et al. In 2023 further emphasized that algorithms built without racial equity review perpetuate bias in care delivery and disability determinations. If VA data remain closed or unexamined, inequity is embedded twice, first in experience, then in evidence. Nelson et al. 2020 offer a framework for centering racial equity across the entire data lifecycle. They remind us that bias enters not only during the analysis but at every stage: collecting, cleaning, linkage, and dissemination. Within the VA, each of these stages involves choices about who counts and who is counted. From episode 2's discussion of history to episode 4's claim disparities, we've seen what happens when institutions control the narrative. The same principle applies here: control the data, and you control the story of inequity itself. And that control has consequences. Studies like Lee et al. In 2024 show that veterans' perceptions of equity differ sharply by race and sex, yet few VA studies separate intersectional identifiers and look at those perspectives deeply. Wong et al. In 2023 found that incorporating both race and neighborhood deprivation data altered the observed COVID-19 hospitalization patterns among veterans, proving how easily bias can hide when data are aggregated or restricted. Without transparent, intersectional data, the average veteran becomes the default, and the Black veteran remains the exception. This episode also builds directly from episode 7's focus on climate and DEI rollbacks. When DEI offices are dismantled, so too are many of the teams responsible for data equity. As noted in reports by the GAO in 2023 and the Federal News Work in 2024, data transparency functions have suffered under recent administrative shifts. Many VA staff now lack clear pathways for reporting or analyzing equity gaps. The result is a chilling effect on accountability and replication, the exact conditions that reinforce structural racism. Across health systems, data have always mirrored power. Aaron et al. 2023 and Wesson et al. 2022 call this the dual risk of big data. While it can illuminate inequities, it can also deepen them when standards and access are not equitable. Inside the VA, this duality is on full display. For decades, internal analysis have documented disparities, from Gotland's 2008 early analysis of racial gaps in federal disability benefits to Weberman et al.'s 2024 findings on MST-related PTSD claims. But those same datasets remain out of reach for independent validation. The question then isn't just how much data the VA has, it's who gets to use it and for what purpose. When researchers without proximity to Black veterans set the research agenda, studies risk becoming descriptive rather than transformative. They can identify disparities without understanding their lived roots. As Gross et al. In 2021 demonstrated in their study of PTSD treatment outcomes, even when race is included as a variable, equity isn't achieved unless cultural context and Black veteran voices guide interpretation. That's the heart of this episode. Data gatekeeping isn't an abstract technical issue. It's a structural mechanism that shapes the entire field of veteran health equity. When access is limited, when datasets are incomplete, and when marginalized voices aren't in the room to frame research questions, the system reproduces inequity under the guise of evidence. As Rabin et al. 2024 remind us, open data is not only a research principle, it's a justice principle. So in this episode, we'll take a deeper look at how these practices play out within the VA. Segment 1 will explore how restricted access limits replication and keeps independent researchers, especially those centering Black veteran perspectives, at arm's length. Segment 2 will unpack the barriers that discourage Black veterans from participating in research and why intersectional data remain rare. Segment 3 will move towards solutions, highlighting how advisory panels, co-design models, and equitable data frameworks can shift the balance of power in evidence making. Finally, we'll discuss what equitable data stewardship should look like inside the VA: transparent, inclusive, and accountable to the communities most affected by inequity. Because at the end of the day, data equity isn't about databases. It's about dignity. It's about who gets to define the story of Black veterans in America and who gets to tell it. When we talk about data gatekeeping, it can sound technical. like a password problem or a security setting. But inside the VA, data access is power access. It determines who gets to test an idea, who can challenge a system's fairness, and who is shut out from the evidence that drives reform. Historically, replication, the backbone of scientific credibility, has been almost impossible in VA based equity research. The VA's data warehouse holds extraordinary detail on veterans' health and benefits outcomes. Yet, independent researchers, especially those without VA appointments, rarely get near it. To access data, a researcher must be inside the firewall or work through complex cooperative research and development agreements that can take years to approve. This isn't just bureaucratic friction, it's epistemic control. It decides who is trusted to look. Kaplan 2024 warned that proposed federal restrictions on CMS data would hamper replication and innovation in precisely the same way, by making secondary use of administrative data too costly and slow for independent scholars. The same dynamic plays out in the VA. Closed systems shield inequity from external verification. And when the data that shape disability determinations or quality of care metrics are locked away, the disparities we've traced in episode 2 become impossible to retest. The consequence is a quiet invisibility. Take Weberman et al. In 2024 in their study, which revealed that Black veterans filing MST-related PTSD claims were 40% more likely to be denied than their white peers. It was rigorous, but also exceptional, because few outside teams can replicate VA claims analysis at that level. Without replication, finding like Weberman's can be dismissed as isolated or inconclusive. That doubt serves the status quo. Open science advocates have begun calling this what it is, a structural equity barrier. Winker, Bloom, and Ani 2023 argue that transparency is not just good science, it is moral accountability. Rabin and al. 2024 take the point further, noting that health systems must include community authorization and data governance. For Black veterans, that would mean advisory panels that decide which equity questions deserve investigation and who can ask them. Right now, those decisions rest almost entirely within internal VA research offices where leadership demographics remain overwhelmingly white. When those who experience inequity are absent from the question-setting table, inequity is mathematically baked in. This isn't new. Scotland in 2008 documented racial gaps in disability benefit outcomes, but could not fully explain why, because critical variables like regional adjudication behavior and examiner race were unavailable outside restricted datasets. More than a decade later, the GAO in 2023 confirmed that similar transparency problems persist. Independent auditors still cannot replicate internal VA equity analysis because the underlying data are proprietary. That means the same disparities, lower approval rates for Black veterans and PTSD and MST and other claims, longer adjudication times, smaller compensation amounts, remain known but unverified. The lack of replication also blocks community partnership. Gross et al. In 2021 demonstrated racial disparities in PTSD residential treatment outcomes, but their ability to interpret cause was limited by the missing social and contextual variables. Imagine if a Black veteran advisory panel had been part of that project. They might have asked different questions about trust, clinician communication, or previous claims experiences. That could explain why treatment success diverged. Without that co-design, the story stays incomplete. Nelson et al. 2020 described this as inequity across the data lifecycle. Bias enters at collection, cleaning, analysis, and access. At the VA, each step is siloed. Administrative staff enter race and ethnicity data, analysis clean it, policy offices interpret it. Few of those actors share identity or lived experience with the populations represented in the data. As a result, what counts as quality is defined from the top down. The VA's reasoning for tight data control is not wholly unfounded. Patient privacy, HIPAA, and the sensitivity of military service records are legitimate concerns. But the blanket assumption that external researchers are a risk rather than a resource creates a chilling effect on innovation. Kaplan 2024 notes that similar arguments at CMS have produced a system where only the most well-funded institutions can afford compliance. Equity researchers, community colleges, and HBCU affiliated scholars rarely have those resources. The gate thus keeps out precisely the people most motivated to ask justice focused questions. This matters because who frames a research question determines what gets measured. When a predominantly white research body sets the agenda, race becomes a variable, not a lens. Padula 2014 and Boleg 2012 both remind us that intersectionality is not an add-on. It is the context of lived experience. But when independent Black scholars can't access data, their questions, rooted in intersectional realities, never enter the analysis pipeline. We've seen the impact across episodes. In episode 3, Mistrust in Pain Care reflected centuries of disbelief in Black pain. In episode 4, we track disparities in claim decisions. In both cases, external researchers struggle to corroborate internal VA data. That opacity feeds mistrust twice. Veterans suspect bias in outcomes, and scholars suspect bias in reporting. Both are right. Charpigan et al. In 2024 describe open data initiatives as engines of inclusion. When more eyes see the data, hidden patterns surface. They found that open datasets attracted more diverse research teams, which in turn produced more equity-relevant publications. In contrast, closed systems produce the same author demographics and citation networks. The VA's current structure resembles the latter. Even well-meaning internal researchers often lack incentives to share or collaborate beyond their immediate division. Rabbit et al. 2024 call for community-governed data collaboratives, where affected populations help define use agreements. Applied to the VA, that can mean a Black Veteran Data Advisory Council, not symbolic, but empowered to approve research proposals, set analytic priorities, and require feedback to the community for which it studies. Such models already exist in other federal contexts, like the NIH's All of Us research program, which includes participant representatives in governance. If the VA replicated that model, it would move from gatekeeping to guardianship. Technically, replication also matters for validity. MCLAV et al. In 2023 found that race data in VA electronic health records were missing or inconsistent in 10 to 15% of cases. Without cross-validation by external researchers, that error margin can distort outcome analysis and quality metrics. When internal reports like the Black Veteran Chart book by Washington et al. In 2023 acknowledge disparities, they are doing so with imperfect inputs. Transparency about data quality would allow independent teams to test correction methods and confirm findings. In addition, all of this data was collected from veterans currently utilizing VA services and not ones that have given up on using the system altogether. So they're only getting one half of a perspective, which in turn can skew results positively in the VA's favor. Aro et al. In 2023 warned that proprietary health data sets limit fairness in AI development. Their insights apply equally to VA analytics. When internal algorithms for claims or scheduling rely on biased training data, inequities become automated. Yet external audits are impossible without data access. That's gatekeeping not just of research, but of accountability itself. Replication then isn't only about science, it's about democracy. As Wesson et al. In 2022 argue, equitable data ecosystems require public oversight and participatory standards. For veterans, that oversight is both a right and a necessity. If the VA's mission is to serve all who served, then its data must be open enough for those same veterans and the scholars who represent them to verify that promise. The through line from episodes 1 through 7 bring us here. We started with history, the ways racism was built into the foundation of American institutions. We followed it through pain care, disability claims, intersectionality, and DEI rollbacks. Each layer revealed a pattern of exclusion. Now we see the data, ostensibly objective, are another layer of that pattern. When access is restricted, inequity becomes invisible by design. Replication is how truth gets its second opinion. Let's talk about participation. It's easy to assume that when data exists, everyone's story is represented. But in practice, participation in VA research and who gets to contribute to the data sets that shape policy is deeply unequal. And for Black veterans, those barriers are not about willingness. They're about trust, representation, and historical exclusion. From episode 2 through 7, we've seen that mistrust doesn't appear out of nowhere. It is built over time by institutions that have repeatedly failed to see Black veterans as credible sources of their own experience. That same dynamic plays out in research participation. In the VA system, data collection often happens during care encounters, through surveys, administrative coding, or clinical interviews. Each of those steps relies on the veteran's willingness to share information and confidence that their words will be used fairly. But after decades of inconsistent treatment, denied claims, and racial bias, that trust is eroded. As Lee et al. 2024 show us, perceptions of fairness and respect differ sharply by race and sex within VA settings. Black veterans, especially women, consistently report feeling unheard or misrepresented in the very systems that gather their data. So it's not surprising that participation in voluntary research is lower, not because Black veterans aren't interested, but because they aren't convinced it will matter. Rosen et al. In 2014 documented that pattern in a very specific context: PTSD disability exams. They found that Black veterans not only rated exam quality lower, but also described the process as adversarial. Now imagine being asked, after that experience, to participate in a research study about PTSD care by the VA, the same system that made you feel that way. Would you believe that your contribution would change the system that denied you in the first place? That hesitation isn't non-compliance, it's context, and it's what we've been drilling over the past 7 episodes. Gross et al. In 2021 found a similar theme in residential PTSD treatment. Black veterans completed treatment less often than their white peers, but not because of lack of motivation. If the VA environment itself feels unsafe, every subsequent invitation to fill out a survey or to consent to a study or to share their story becomes another risk. That mistrust compounds when veterans see how little published research reflects their experiences. In the literature reviewed across this podcast, less than 15% of the studies on VA mental health outcomes have a primary focus on race or intersectionality. Even fewer are led by Black principal investigators or advisory boards. That gap isn't just academic, it shapes the questions we keep asking. If research keeps centering universal veterans, it keeps missing the specific intersections of race, gender, trauma, and identity that shape Black veteran outcomes. Weberman et al. 2024 exposed how this invisibility has real consequences. Their analysis of MST-related PTSD claims showed denial rates nearly 40% higher for Black veterans. Yet, within VA internal research portfolios, MST equity studies remain rare. That's not an oversight. It's a reflection of how topics are prioritized when decision makers don't reflect the communities most affected. When women of color aren't in the room to define the questions, their stories don't enter the data set. This ties directly to Nelson et al.'s 2020 framework for equity across the data lifecycle. They note that representation and participation is not achieved by recruitment alone. It requires equitable consent, transparency about use, and accountability to participants. But the VA research protocols rarely guarantee any of those things. Even when Black veterans participate, they seldom hear back about the results or see tangible change, violating what Rabin et al. 2024 call reciprocal value and equity-centered data sharing. Without reciprocity, participation feels extractive. The system asks for your story, then disappears with it. There are structural barriers too. Hernandez et al. 2020 and Peltzman et al. 2022 both point out that race and ethnicity data in VA records are often inaccurate or incomplete. Sometimes race isn't asked directly. Other times it's inputted from legacy systems or older administrative fields. For veterans who identify with multiple racial or ethnic backgrounds, or who distrust why race is being asked, the process can feel invasive or irrelevant. The result is uneven data that erase complexity. Intersectionality disappears not because it isn't real, but because it isn't measured. Winker et al. 2023 described this as the equity paradox of data. The very systems meant to make inequities visible often reproduce them, because marginalized people are least likely to be safely represented within them. And when data collection is conducted without co-design or lived experience oversight, the system collects about people rather than with them. That distinction matters. It's the difference between surveillance and solidarity. Carried all in 2023 exposed similar dynamics in the use of clinical algorithms. When race-adjusted models were used without transparency, they systematically underrepresented minority patient needs. The same logic applies to VA data. When Black veterans' participation is low, algorithmic models trained on those data sets may systematically underpredict risk, pain, or benefit eligibility. That's not a technical flaw, it's a feedback loop of inequity. And participation barriers don't stop at trust or technical entry. Political and funding priorities shape participation too. Karping et al. 2024 found that open data initiatives produce more racially diverse research teams and more equity-focused topics. But in closed systems like the VA, where internal approvals govern study design, external community researchers, including those from HBCUs, are often locked out of access and therefore locked out of authorship. This reinforces a cycle where the same perspectives dominate the literature and the same communities are studied rather than empowered. The cumulative effect is what we might call narrative compression. The stories of Black veterans become statistically smaller with every barrier to participation. Even when inequities are visible in data, the lack of intersectional detail blurs the picture. Wong et al. 2023 demonstrated how adding neighborhood-level deprivation data changed the interpretation of racial disparities in COVID-19 hospitalizations. Before adjustment, the narrative was Black veterans were more likely to be hospitalized. After adding context, the story became Black veterans from under-resourced communities face higher exposure and risk. That's what intersectionality does. It turns blame into understanding. Padula in 2014 would call that shift a counter-stereotypical narrative. When we examine disparities without context, we risk implying that race itself is the cause. But when intersectionality is included, the focus moves to systems, not individuals. And that is precisely what has been missing in much of VA research: system-level accountability for participation inequities. We can't talk about barriers to participation without acknowledging research fatigue as well. Many veterans, especially those from underrepresented groups, report being overstudied but underseen. They're invited to focus groups, surveys, and pilots, but rarely see resulting change in policy or care. This fatigue reinforces withdrawal. Why share again if nothing changes? Rabin et al. 2024 proposed transparent data feedback loops as a solution, closing the circle so that participants understand how their input shaped outcomes. That feedback isn't just good ethics, it rebuilds trust, one study at a time. Black women veterans experience these barriers in compounded ways. As discussed in episode 5, intersectionality and visibility operates when both race and gender are marginalized within research design. Weberman et al. 2024 found that the largest disparities in PTSD claim approvals among Black women, a finding consistent with Murdoch et al.'s 2025 and Gross et al. 2021 study. Yet, there is no ongoing VA-funded research program specifically focused on Black women veterans' claims experiences. The absence is not an oversight, it is the consequence of who controls access and who sets priorities. Participation barriers, in other words, are not random. They are the predictable result of structural mistrust. procedural exclusion, and limited equity infrastructure. When DEI offices were dismantled, many VA sites lost their local equity liaisons. Without those roles, recruitment falls to convenient samples, whoever is easiest to reach. And easy to reach rarely includes veterans who have been marginalized by geography, race, or prior experience with discrimination. The irony is that participation barriers hurt the system too. Incomplete data lead to incomplete science. When entire groups are underrepresented in research, clinical guidelines, benefits algorithms, and program evaluations are built on distorted baselines. Wesson et al. 2022 describes this as the blind spot effect of big data. What's missing shapes outcomes as much as what's present. Inside the VA, that blind spot has ethical weight. It means the nation's largest integrated health system cannot claim to understand the veterans it serves if its research participants do not reflect them. From a policy lens, Washington et al. 2023 demonstrate that even within VA's own patient experience data, racial gaps persist in satisfaction, access, and quality of care. Those are measurable disparities, but they only exist because someone fought to collect that data. Imagine what remains unseen when participation barriers silence entire segments of the population. If intersectionality is the map of lived experience, participation is the compass. Without both, we are navigating equity in the dark. When we talk about solutions, it's tempting to look for a new technology, better dashboards, smarter AI, bigger data sets. But if we've learned anything from episodes 1 through 7, it's that equity isn't a technical problem. It's a relational one. So, who is trusted to define the data? Who participates in designing the systems? And who holds decision-making power? That's where the real change happens. The question isn't whether the VA collects enough data. It does. The question is whether those data are collected, interpreted, and used in ways that are accountable to the communities they describe. For Black veterans, data have too often been something done to them, not done with them. And if that dynamic doesn't shift, every data set, no matter how large, will continue to reproduce the same blind spots. Nelson et al. In 2020 provide one of the clearest frameworks for doing this. They argue that racial equity must be centered throughout the entire administrative data lifecycle, from collection to dissemination. That means designing not just for inclusion at the end when results are published, but for participation at the beginning when research questions are formed. They call for shared governance in data, a model that positions affected communities as co-owners of both the process and its outcomes. Inside the VA, that could look like the Black Veteran Advisory Panels embedded at the research design stage. These panels wouldn't simply review studies after the fact. They would co-create the research agenda, define success metrics, and decide which equity gaps deserve attention. Rabbit et al. 2024 described this as a community authorization model, where data use is legitimate only if those represented consent to and guide its purpose. Imagine if every major VA study on PTSD, pain care, or disability benefits required co-signature from a veteran equity advisory group. That's not bureaucracy. It's justice built into methodology. The logic is simple. When you change who's in the room, you change the questions being asked. The principle runs through every episode of this podcast. In episode 2, we saw history shapes mistrust. In episode 3, we explore how pain and disbelief reinforce exclusion. In episode 4, we examine how disparities in claims stem from invisible decision biases. In episode 5, we learned that intersectionality is not negotiable if we want to see the full truth when it came to Black veteran women, and that was followed up in episode 6. Each of these moments points towards one solution: shared authority. But co-design isn't just an ethical choice, it's a data quality strategy. Nelson et al. 2020 and Winker et al. 2023 both found that community-engaged data collection produces more accurate, complete, and actionable information. Why? Because when participants trust the process, they disclose more and they correct errors. That's what we saw in Almclave et al. 2023, where electronic self-reporting improved race and ethnicity accuracy within VA records. That improvement happened because veterans felt direct ownership over their data. Ownership is engagement. Engagement is quality. Creating advisory panels isn't new to public health. It's standard practice in community-based participatory research. But in the VA, advisory bodies often exist only for special initiatives or pilot programs. To make a real difference, these groups must be institutionalized. That means compensating members, integrating them into research budgets, and including them in performance evaluations. As Rabin et al. 2024 remind us, equitable participation must be funded participation. Otherwise, code design becomes symbolic. A permanent Veterans Equity Data Advisory Board could operate under the VA Office of Health Equity, modeled after the NIH's All of Us Community Governance Framework. Members could include Black veterans, women veterans, LGBTQ+ veterans, tribal representatives, and disability advocates, all with decision authority over data sharing agreements and study priorities. The GAO in 2023 emphasized that the VA still lacks a unified mechanism for evaluating equity across data domains, health, benefits, and administrative operations, and that was before the DEI rollbacks. An advisory board could fill the gap, ensuring that data equity is not soiled into one office but embedded across the entire enterprise. These panels could also guide external collaborations. Right now, independent researchers often face insurmountable obstacles getting approval to use the VA data. If an advisory panel included external scholars, particularly from historically black colleges and universities, also HBCUs, it could create a vetted pathway for external access that aligns with privacy and justice. This would not only diversify the research community, but also redistribute epistemic power. Who gets to define what counts as knowledge? Technology plays a role too, but only if it's governed equitably. Aurora et al. In 2023 and Carey et al. 2023 warned that AI and algorithmic tools can amplify bias when datasets lack diversity or context. VA algorithms currently shape decisions from scheduling to risk stratification to benefits adjudication. If data feeding those models come from historically biased systems, automation simply makes discrimination faster. The solution isn't to abandon data science, it's to audit it through an equity lens. That means requiring bias reviews for an AI model used in clinical or administrative decision making. Carey et al. 2023 proposed an equity audit checklist that could easily be adapted for the VA. These audits would look not only at predictive accuracy, but also at representational equity. Are the training datasets reflective of veteran diversity? Are race and gender variables being used responsibly, or are they standing in for structural factors? This isn't theoretical. Wesson et al. 2022 describe how equitable big data systems balance innovation with oversight by involving affected communities in risk-benefits analysis. In the VA context, that can mean building data stewardship committees at each medical center that include veteran advocates, clinicians, and data scientists working side by side. Their task? To review major analytic projects and ensure they align with racial and intersectional equity goals. That kind of structure doesn't slow innovation, it safeguards it. Another principle that emerges from the literature is reciprocity. Rabin et al. 2024 and Winker et al. 2023 stress that data equity requires bidirectional communication. Participants should know not just that their data is being used, but how. In the VA, this could mean transparent feedback loops, public dashboards showing what research questions are asked, what was found, and what was implemented as a result. The level of openness would also rebuild trust among veterans who feel research is something that happens behind closed doors. Karpinen et al. 2024 called diversity and inclusion a hidden additional benefit of open data. The research found that when data sets were openly available, more diverse teams formed organically, producing broader and more socially relevant findings. In other words, openness itself is a diversity mechanism. For the VA, that's a call to shift from guarding data to stewarding it. When data becomes a shared resource, equity stops being a compliant box and becomes a collective project. Every stakeholder, from veteran participants to researchers to clinicians, contribute to shaping the evidence base. At the policy level, the path forward is clear. 1. Establish a VA Veterans Equity Data Advisory Board under the Office of Health Equity, empowered to review and approve data access policies. 2. Require equity audits for all analytic and AI models used in VA healthcare and benefits decision making. 3. Develop public-facing data equity dashboards to communicate findings, actions, and accountability measures transparently. 4. Fund partnerships with HBCUs and minority-serving institutions to diversify who accesses and analyzes VA data. And 5. Institutionalize community feedback loops. Ensure that Black veterans and other underrepresented groups receive updates on how their participation informs practice and policy. These aren't abstract ideals. They're practical implementations of what open science advocates like Winkler et al. 2023 and Rabin et al. 2024 have already proven works. They also align directly with the GAO 2023 recommendations for improving data transparency and cross-system accountability. The urgency of these reforms have grown in the wake of DEI rollbacks. As discussed in Episode 7, many VA equity offices have been defunded or restructured, leaving data governance vulnerable to inconsistency. Federal News Network in 2024 reported that several facilities paused diversity hiring and training initiatives, indirectly weakening the infrastructure of equitable research participation. Advisory panels can serve as a stabilizing force, nonpartisan, community-rooted bodies that sustain equity efforts regardless of political climate. Intersectionality aids another layer of urgency. As Boleg 2012 reminds us, systems designed for average populations inevitably fail those at the margins. Advisory panels that reflect intersectional diversity, race, gender, disability, sexuality, can ensure that policy is informed by those with layered identities, not just single access perspectives. That's how we operationalize trust, by transferring authority to those most impacted. The VA has the size, reach, and mission to lead the nation in data equity. What it needs now is courage. The courage to share power, not just data. Because in the end, equitable data frameworks are not just about transparency, they're about transformation. They redefine evidence as shared language rather than gatekeeping tools. When advisory panels become standard, when co-design is expected, when transparency is built into the system, the VA can finally say what is long promised, that every veteran's experience matters and every veteran's data counts. When we started this episode, we asked a simple question: who gets to ask the questions? And after looking at the VA's data systems, its research structures, and its gatekeeping practices, the answer is clear. Too often, it isn't the people most affected by inequity. That's the quiet power imbalance that shapes everything downstream, from who gets studied, to what gets funded, to which findings are ever seen by the public. Black veterans live with the consequences of that imbalance every day. They show up in the data sets that don't reflect their realities, in studies that overlook their perspectives, and in systems that use their information but rarely share the benefits. That's not data equity, that's extraction. But what gives this story hope is that we already know what to do. We know from Nelson and colleagues in 2020 that centering racial equity across the data lifecycle works. And we know from Rabin et al. 2024 and Karpinen et al. 2024 that open data and co-design build both accuracy and trust. The path forward isn't mysterious. It's just rarely prioritized. Across this season, we've seen that data isn't neutral. It reflects the hands that hold them. When data is closed off, inequity hides. When data is shared, analyzed collaboratively, and held accountable to the people they describe, justice becomes possible. In many ways, the VA stands at a crossroads. It can keep guarding information as if transparency were a threat, or it can reimagine stewardship as partnership, shifting from protecting to empowerment. That shift would mean building permanent Black veteran advisory boards, funding community co-researchers, and opening the doors to historically Black colleges and universities as equal data partners. It would mean treating every dataset as a relationship, not a resource. This isn't just a technical reform, it's a cultural one, because every cell of data in the VA system represents someone's story. And those stories, especially for Black veterans, are too often buried beneath bureaucracy and mistrust. Equitable data stewardship is about bringing those stories back into the light, fully, respectfully, and with the authority they deserve. So, as we close this episode, let's remember what open science really means. It's not just about code books or data sets, it's about courage. The courage to let others see what you see, the courage to invite scrutiny, to share credit, and to build knowledge together instead of guarding it alone. In the end, equity isn't about who holds the data, it's about who the data serves. And when veterans, especially Black veterans, can see themselves fully and accurately reflected in the nation's records, the VA will finally be able to say it honors the truth of their service. In episode 9, we'll bring it all home. We'll look at what systemic accountability really looks like, from leadership to frontline practice, and how the principles we've talked about all season can move from research into action. Because data might reveal the problem, but it's people who build the solution. Thank you for staying on this journey with me for so long. As we start to wrap this up, I want to remind you to like and share this with a veteran, share it with a clinician, and a leader who helps, works, and supports Black veterans. Until next week, I'll see you then.